we're there. Oh no, I've shared the wrong screen, I think. Sorry. And I'm afraid this is just a bit of an aid memoir to me because I didn't have time to properly write it. Okay. So essentially, what's the point? What's the point of Journal Club? These are the things that I'm sort of going to go over. And then have a little bit of a discussion about the importance of content versus appraisal. Discuss considering your audience. Now, obviously, you should do that with any presentation, but as we've sort of highlighted, that's more in terms of keeping a journal club going. You know, you need to think, is your, you know, who are your audience? Are they going to be speciality trainees? Are they going to be more disparate trainees? Is it going to include people from a nursing background, or conversely, you know, are you giving a journal club to a group of research interested trainees who are going to be on a different level? And then going over choosing a paper, what makes a good paper, and I probably won't get to designing a feedback form. Okay. So when it comes to what the point, I think there's different sorts of journal clubs. So some journal clubs might focus on critical appraisal and improving your critical appraisal skills. Other journal clubs might focus on how do you get the answers to your clinical questions from the literature. Those sort of feel a little bit less relevant in the era of UpToDate and other aggregator services. However, I think that's where maybe some of the appraisal skills are being lost, is because people just go to that and it gives you a well-curated answer. And then obviously there's the sort of more traditional journal club that focuses on content. The problem with content is that content hogs bandwidth, in my experience. If you have people who, you know, if it's an interesting paper or a very relevant paper to that particular group of people, they're not really interested in the methods. They're not really interested in the appraisal. They're just really interested in the outcome and in what the findings of that paper was. The flip side to that is if you choose a paper to appraise where the content feels entirely irrelevant to your audience, hence considering the audience again, then you risk losing engagement and everybody just being bored of what goes on, and then that's the importance of considering the audience. Sorry, we'll go in here. I've skipped over using a CASP tool for critical appraisal, but maybe couldn't come on to that next. But again, whether or not you're using CASP tools, again, depends a little bit on your audience. Because for me, CASP tools are useful for people who don't do very much critical appraisal, who are not particularly research active themselves, and they are just useful, relatively simple frameworks to help people think critically about any papers that they come across. And personally, I might look at a CASP tool for a particular type of study, but usually I'm not going to be doing that, and usually I am going to be asking people to consider things a little bit more in the round. So if we think about some of these different types of journal clubs and how we can support them, as a journal club organizer, it is in fact, it's a huge amount of work to be both doing the rota. Oh, sorry. One other thing that I can't remember if I've said is the critical importance of asking the presenter to circulate the paper in advance. Ideally, in my view, a week in advance of the journal club event, but at the very least a few days. Because whatever the type of journal club you are delivering, it is so everybody will get so much more out of a journal club if they've had the paper to read in advance. And one of the things that I would challenge you to think about, because I haven't found a good way of doing it, is how to encourage the audience to have read the paper, because I really think it makes a huge difference to the amount that people can get out of a journal club. But for you to be choosing the paper and organising the rota and remembering to send out reminder emails to the presenters so you don't have those forgotten missed educational opportunities is a lot of work. On the other hand, if you allow presenters to choose their own papers, you can end up with a disparate and not particularly useful sequence of events. Now, what I'm going to do, because I didn't have time to do this, I'm going to jot down a few thoughts as we go along so that I can put this out as an aid memoir. One of the other things that's important to consider is your teaching cycle. And by that, I mean, if you are doing a critical appraisal or a PK-focused journal club, it actually doesn't matter if you end up doing the same paper over and over again, as long as it's not the same audience who are hearing that. And so for most institutions, a year will mean that you've not got the same group of people the following year, and you can revisit papers. And so that's not to say that as a presenter, as an organizer, you would keep reusing papers, but it does mean that you don't need to specify from year to year that people should not be using the same papers. On the other hand, if it happens to be within a 4-month block where everybody's the same, and it just so happens that the presenter wasn't there when the very same paper was presented 6 weeks ago, that clearly is not going to engage people's interests. So you do need to have some mechanism to prevent repetition. The other problem with allowing people to choose their own is you may very well find that you end up with people always choosing randomized controlled trials just because they know how to appraise them. So that's the other thing you need to keep a track of an organizer. But you could potentially do that without necessarily choosing papers yourself, because it really is quite a big effort week after week to be picking out a paper for somebody to appraise, because the key quality of papers is that they need to be available full text, because there's no point in doing something that people can't read in advance. The current guidelines that I have for people to select their article in Leeds is it's got to be primary research, relevant to paediatrics, But I say relevant to pediatrics because obviously I'm mostly having a general pediatric audience. And, you know, you might have a paper that's that's about teaching or a teaching intervention that might not be PED specific, but it's still relevant to what we do. So it just needs to be relevant to your audience. And I have a criteria that it's got to be published in the last year with a little bit of wiggle room. I think that's just really to be current, and that's obviously not relevant if you're doing a PICO journal club. That's more for the critical appraisal or the content journal clubs, and that's just to keep things fresh and current. The other criteria I have for the critical appraisal journal clubs is that it's got to be primary research. That's more because when people go to systematic reviews and meta-analyses, as all you will probably be aware, appraising those requires very different tools and very different thinking. And I think at the level that I'm operating at with our presenters, I don't want people to be deviating from, you know, thinking about primary research studies, because I think that's where things start. So equally, that might be something that if you've got a content-focused journal club, obviously if you've got a PICO journal club, you might end up with a meta-analysis or a systematic review. Or if there's a research-interested group, then you might end up with that. But for me, in the general group, we have primary research. Okay. Let's just go back very slightly to what I said I would talk about. Okay. And then in terms of the content issue, I think that's always a tricky one. And I suspect that you will all have had your own experiences of journal clubs that you think run well and not run well. I'll just give one example of, you know, the journal club from a presenter side where I thought the content actually did run well, although it's a huge amount of work for the presenters. So with the ID Journal Club, when I was in Toronto, there was quite a heavy expectation on the presenter to do a lot of background reading and really convert it into a summary, a literature sort of summary. So I think my paper that I was given was a Greek study with a relatively short follow-up on the impact of the 3 months isoniazid and rifampicin as treatment for latent TB. Now, this is a slightly controversial topic because treating latent TB, you know, how long do you need to follow up for? How can you make sure you've captured the right population? So there's enough to treat about, but there's also, you know, the whole background of why and how we treat latent TB and what that rests upon. And because a lot of those studies are from the 50s and 60s, you know, it becomes part of the canon rather than part of people's current knowledge. So you can do a focused, a content journal club that becomes a very useful educational resource, but that puts a lot on the presenter. And I just know that so for those of you who don't know, so in the journal club that I run, the presenters mostly will be LSTs. They can be GP trainees, foundation year docs, pediatric STs, and the audience is sort of a general pediatric audience. And then the other thing that in terms of supporting your presenters, you can do some stuff with guidance and templates. And so don't worry, I'll correct the spelling after that. And so this is where I will just stop sharing that and start sharing some of the resources that we use in Leeds. And I will share my screen for that. So we do 2 different types of journal club here in Leeds. The first is PICO. I take no I take no credit for this whatsoever, but I think that Peter would be happy for me to share a refined version of this. So essentially, the Pico Journal Club is very prescriptive. There's lots of hidden slides. Can you all see this okay as I'm moving through? Neil, I can see your face. Can you just nod? Yeah, thank you. So, it's very prescriptive. It goes through, how you come up with your clinical question. It goes through how you formulate your PICO question, asking people to choose 3 PICO questions, and then taking people through a little bit of literature search and ending up with search strings that will actually help, guide you into working out which which question you're actually going to settle in on, and then again taking people through that more detailed literature search and suggestions about which databases to do that, and then coming up with a really very sort of prescriptive appraisal. And this is where maybe a CASP tool would fit. The problem, of course, with putting this prescriptive appraisal in here, and a problem that I haven't yet got to, is that you might end up with very different studies. So here you might end up with a systematic review or meta-analysis, and doing that sort of appraisal for that is tricky. The other type of journal club that we do is critical appraisal, and here I have sort of a much bigger document for people to read, to really try and encourage people to read through this and then think through that study. And this is generic for really any study. Clearly, this sort of level of thinking about stuff is not something that you do every day when you're faced with reading a paper, but something that hopefully would be useful for people sitting down and thinking through. And I've got a couple of links in here, which I hope are still live. I haven't checked them for a while, about different sorts of bias that you might be coming across. Because for me, one of the most difficult things to think about, and one of those things that really comes with time and doing your own research, is understanding a little bit more about bias and spotting elements of bias, but also it's going through obvious things such as conflicts of interest. And I do a little sort of template for that one as well. The problem is with doing a sort of template for this, and this is another pitfall, is whereas the PICO template is very prescriptive and designed to be used as a template, all I try to do with the critical appraisal template is just really encourage people to present the methods and the results within a relatively few slides to leave enough time for the critical appraisal, because the other thing that I would find is that people then tend to spend quite a long time on the content and then not on the appraisal. If you want a journal club to be an opportunity for the presenter to learn about appraisal and for the audience, I think you do need some sort of template, because otherwise you get fairly pathetic critical appraisals like, I just thought this was a good paper, or highlighting the weaknesses that the authors had actually highlighted themselves, rather than thinking through any other sources of bias. So having some sort of template is useful. Okay. Let's go back to sharing the other window. So I hope that it's clear to a certain extent about why I haven't really honed in on the CASP template so far, or presented you with the CASP templates that you should use, because actually from my point of view, want to encourage in general people to think of a little bit more deeply about things. But having said that, the checkboxes can be useful, and it's important to think about those things. In terms of one template over another, though, this is where once again I think it's horses for courses, and I wouldn't sort of point people in one direction. I think there are two things that can affect which template you choose. One is for a particular paper or a particular type of paper, you can have a look at the different template resources and pick on one that you like and feel works well. The other thing that you might do is that you might find that you've been to some massively inspirational talk, i.e. not this one, and they had a brilliant template that you think fitted certain types of studies really, really well, and you take that forward and recommend that people use that. And so and I think that both of those is very valid. The other thing that is linked, and I think this is worth saying here, is you will all have noticed, and you probably do this yourselves, is there are three bits to a paper fundamentally. You've got the stuff that anyone pretty much can understand: background, results, conclusions, discussion. Then you've got the bits that can be really quite tedious unless you read them in great detail, i.e. the methods. Clearly, the methods are absolutely crucial to appraising a paper and to understanding whether it's a good paper or not. Having said that, if you do read them carefully, then they are understandable for most people until you get to the stats. The reason I will just put a little New England Journal comment there, and there are some other papers that do that, is that even if the main article is available either free full text or via your library as a full text article, the New England Journal in particular is terrible at hiving the methods off into supplementary chapters that are only available to individual subscribers or if you've got an account. And clearly, for most journal clubs, you absolutely need to have access to the methods. So that is probably one of the other things that's worth stipulating or worth doing if you're finding that. Okay. And then the last bit of the paper that almost everybody skips over is the statistics. And how can we get people to actually be thinking about stats? Now, there's clearly a limit to most of our statistical abilities unless you have a particular aptitude or you've been doing a load of research yourself. And you know, understanding multi-level linear modeling with random effects is still something my brain can't cope with, even though it's something that's being done relatively often. So when it comes to statistics, I think of separating them out into three sort of categories. The first is the statistics that we will all have heard of and be familiar reading about, even if we don't understand them. So that might be your descriptive statistics, your means, your medians, your modes, your sensitivities, your specificities. Then there will be your basic statistical significance tests, your t-test, chi-squared, Kruskal-Wallis. Then there will be your modelling, where most of us have heard of logistic and linear regression, and then they start to get a little bit more esoteric. And then I'm sure you've all read papers where somebody brings up a statistical test that you've never heard of. And I'm always a little bit suspicious when I see statistical tests that I've never heard of. And essentially, I think the useful thing that you can drag out of people if you give them a bit of guidance on the stats is to point people in the right direction to understand whether or not the statistical methods are appropriate. So if there's a stats method you've never heard of, that's when I normally Google it and try and understand it. One of the lessons that I say is that when it comes to stats, Wikipedia is definitely not your friend, because when you go to Wikipedia, you find that the description of a statistical method focuses on the maths behind that method, which is not what we want to know at all. And the useful things when you Google a statistical method is you want to pick out ideally something that says something along the lines of, you know, BMJ ABC of statistics, or biomedical statistics past notes or lecture notes. And what I do when I've got a stats method that I haven't heard of is I Google it and I look for those things and I read 4 or 5 of them, and one of them will make sense to me, and I can understand that. And so that sort of generic guidance in terms of understanding stats is useful. And the first thing, you know, and this is where knowing your audience is important. So for example, with my stats naive junior cohort, I will tend to focus on the basic statistics that I'd like them to talk about. So sometimes that might be as simple as talking about difference between medians and modes and means. Sometimes that will be taking people through sensitivity, specificity, negative and positive predictive values. Sometimes that might be taking people through you know, whether the data in this study is parametric or non-parametric, and somebody has used the wrong thing, and unbelievably it does still happen. You know, the number of papers we've seen in our journal club where the data is clearly going to be non-parametric, it's not been transformed, and yet people are using parametric methods to analyze it, is depressing, really. And then there are some other statistics learning points, like why you should never do statistical significance testing on your baseline characteristic values, that are either things that you just have to reiterate time and time again. And if anyone's interested in that, you just need to look at the Doug Altman BMJ ABC of statistics on baseline characteristics about why you shouldn't do that. But the bottom line of that boils down to the fact that if you've got an enormous study, difference of age of like 1 day between 2 different groups can be statistically significant, even though it's clearly irrelevant to the outcome of the study. If you've got a relatively small study, you might have a difference of age of 10 years between the 2 groups, and that won't come out as statistically significant, that doesn't mean it's not going to bias the study. I am going to stop sharing there for a moment to give a couple of minutes just for people to, if anybody wants to ask anything, share their experiences of good or bad journal clubs, share their experience of CASPs, think about anything that I've said that may chime with them, think about anything that I've said that doesn't make sense, and just question that. And then what I can do is maybe just go through a little bit of, I have an example critical appraisal journal club that may highlight some of the points that I've been talking about in terms of giving a guidance and setting up a template. So anyone got any observations so far? Any thoughts?
Just I was going to ask you one thing,
oh my
Sean.
God, I'm wasting my time. Why did I bother coming for this hour? When he hasn't even bothered to do a presentation. That's fine, as long as you then tell me what you wanted to get out of this session, and I can try and correct my deficiencies. So
I've got one for you, Sean.
Just give a few minutes.
I've got a question, Sean, if you're
Yes, Neil.
It was just on what you were saying about circulating the paper, and how many people often have got round to reading it. I just wondered what advice you gave to your presenters on in the sense of, do you prepare a presentation presuming people have read the paper, or do you accept that there's going to be a proportion of your audience that haven't read it, and therefore you should always present the basics of the paper as well as your appraisal?
So yes, so you should present the basics, because there's always going to be people who haven't read it. And if there's people in the audience who haven't read it, it's going to be completely useless to them if you just jump straight into your critical appraisal. But what I do try and do, and obviously this might not be relevant for the content-focused journal club if that's what you're wanting to run, but for those where the appraisal is important, I just try and encourage the presenters to distill the methods, results, and background into a maximum of 6 slides. So, you've got one background slide, 2 or 3 method slide, 2 or 3 results slides, and 1 discussion slide, so that you're really focusing and don't go spiraling off into long descriptions, and give enough time for the critical appraisal. I haven't yet found a good way of encouraging the audience to have read the paper. What's been suggested to me, but I haven't yet managed to implement it, is to assign audience members to ask a question of the presenter at the end based on the paper, but I haven't managed to do that yet. Okay. Anybody else got any observations, thoughts, insights to share? Has anything that I've said been useful?
Absolutely.
Hello, Sean. I'm Verena. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Bridge, so thank you very much for joining us today. Yeah, no, it's been a really good presentation on kind of like the things that we need to think about when we plan for the journal club, both from our perspective in terms of planning the whole series of the journal club, but also kind of like from the presenter's perspective. But so as a lay kind of like presenter, do you what tips do you have in terms of how to choose a good paper, or what is most appropriate for a journal club?
So again, I think that it depends on the audience. I did, highlight those criteria that I use for the Leeds Journal Club for critical appraisal. So primary research published in the last year, relevant to paediatrics, but otherwise have it very broad. But, obviously peds oncology do their journal club, and they're really not going to want to know about, the latest advances in type 1 SMA treatment. You want to, it's got to be relevant to that audience. So I do think it depends what you're going to do. Alex, thank you very much for that question. I think one of the things you have to have is consultant support and some buy-in. So when I started in Leeds over 10 years ago, there were two issues. The first is that with the amalgamation between Leeds, Jimmy's and LGI, and quite how busy it was, in winter, we'd regularly have 60 to 80 inpatients, and getting around them in a ward round was a nightmare. Attendance at lunchtime educational sessions have been a bit deprioritized, so we had a bit of work to do there, and that's the first bit of buy-in that you need. And then the second bit of buy-in that you need is you've got to have somebody to supervise this, because if it's just a bunch of the blind leading the blind, then it's not going to be useful. And you've got to have somebody who's got a bit of a Scooby about what's going on. You don't have to be expert, you just have to be interested, but you do have to have read the paper yourself if you're going to be supervising that particular journal club. And probably where it would work best is if there's a panel of 3 or 4 of you, and something this group might do, for example, is there's no real, you could present the same journal article in 4 different institutions in the same week. Do you know what I mean? There's nothing that would reduce the work if you've got a little regional group of you who choose papers and highlight statistical learning points that people should be teaching about. That could reduce the workload if you had a little collaborative like that, even though supervising within that. But you need to have consultant buy-in to make sure people are going to that session and that there's an expectation that people go to it. And in terms of the participation in the presentation, 2 things that you can do that would be useful is, firstly, obviously have an expectation that's doing it. Whether you quite want to go as far as exception reporting the missed educational opportunity when whoever you put down on the rota doesn't turn up to do their presentation, is one way of doing it. I do think that some sort of template, though, and written guidance can be quite useful for people who are, because there'll be different reasons for not wanting to present, won't there? There'll be people who think, this is irrelevant to me, and basically you can question why they even bother being doctors. There are other people who are just scared and feel that it's outside their comfort zone and haven't really thought about it. And to those people, doing a sort of PICO journal club, I think, can be useful in that regard, because you start with a clinical question and then it's getting stuff out of the literature with a little bit of critical appraisal at the end. And whether you have something that's as prescriptive as that PICO workbook. And then for other people, just having maybe, like my text document, just a little bit of a narrative of what sort of things you should do and what sort of things you should be thinking about as you're reading your paper, that might be enough. So it's just providing a little bit of those things. And ultimately, the other thing that you could do, Alex, is you could ask all your consultants at Pinderfields, if you happen to come across an interesting paper this week, could you just email me with the details? And so that will reduce your work in finding a paper that's going to be relevant, and you could pass that on to your presenter. When I started doing the journal club, before Peter Cartledge introduced the PICO, every week I was having to not only find a paper, but read that paper before I even sent it out, make sure it was available to people, and come up with a stats learning point. And it was a huge amount of work, and I didn't always manage to keep up with that. So you have to think about what your workload's going to be as well. But the stats learning point, so for example, it probably is a I'll just come back to the stats learning point. All right. So anybody got any more questions before I just bob on to my example? No? Okay. So one of the things that I used to do, and one thing that might be feasible in your institution, depending on your rotation things, is I used to, at the beginning of every rotation, I used to give an example journal club so that people would know. The problem is now, since we moved to the September and March ST rotations, we now have rotations in Leeds in August, September, December, February, March, and April. And so it's just not feasible to be giving an example journal club at the beginning of each rotation. But if you're in an institution where you've just got PEDS STs, and so you've only got 2 rotations a year, that is feasible, you know, to be giving an example journal club in the first week that people are actually there. So that's another thing that you could think about. And when I was doing that, I would give this presentation, and I won't have time to go through it now because we've only got about 10 minutes left. Can you all see something that says Journal Club, a model? Just nod, right. Okay, so what I would do with this is the grey slides are explanation slides and the white slides, as it were my journal club.
Sean, do you realise you're muted?
How long have I been muted for? Oh, now I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, about a minute. Sorry, I thought you might be on the phone. Might have had to take the phone,
No,
but then
no,
when
no,
I
no,
saw
no,
the slides
okay.
going,
So where did we get to?
yeah, about there.
So
Yeah.
did I talk through this?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So then just highlighting really a couple of methods, you know, a couple of method slides, maybe 2 to 4 method slides. Then you always need your disposal diagram. The point I was making here, I probably will skip over, but yes, some results slides and then discussion slide. And the issue that I had with this paper was they talked about, you know, how this paper, which was obviously set up as a diagnostic accuracy paper, really then had massive overreach in saying, oh, and because these are the specificity and sensitivity, we need to introduce this into as a general screening process. So that was the overreach. And then, so these are my sort of explanation slides and just suggestions to people about things you need to be thinking about when you are looking at any paper. This is sort of a reduced thing of my text document, really, and the sort of things that people should be looking at, whether you feel results are reported, a little bit about whether, you know, analysis is appropriate and whether they've got proportionate conclusions. And I have sort of emphasized my sort of believability index, you know, who did it, when did they did it, how long was the delay to publication, where did they do it, were there any conflicts of interest, including academic, does the result feel plausible? And I give the example of that. There was actually a very well done, very well reported study that showed that sucrose had absolutely no effect on nociceptive pathways in neonates. So although it was an excellent study, it came up with a result that's so opposed to our clinical experience that it sort of fell down on plausibility, even though it does raise some interesting questions, and then obviously generalizability. And then I do highlight, this is my mind the gap slide. So I highlight to presenters, if you're reading a paper and something feels like it's missing, that's the bit that you should hone in on, because they're probably missing for a reason. And then my nobody's perfect slide. So once you've ripped a paper to shreds, you need to pull it back together and say, well, actually, what we learn from that? So then this was sort of my couple of appraisal slides, as in me being the presenter for this paper, and then highlighting potential resources that people might go to for specific things. So here, this was a diagnostic accuracy study. So there's a critical appraisal sheet for the diagnostic study, and those are the questions that are brought out in the diagnostic test appraisal. And so this is my appraisal of their subjects and methods. This is my appraisal of their analysis and conclusion. And then this was the reason I really wanted to go through this is I would have given myself the stats learning point here of talking about sensitivity, specificity, and maybe negative and positive predictive. I think I just did sensitivity and specificity. So really just going over that, going over your 2x2 table, what sensitivity is, what specificity is, just so people are thinking about that and embedding that. I could equally have done, you know, negative and positive predictive values and the differences between sensitivity and specificity and negative and positive predictive values. So things that are a little bit meeting, but again, not asking people to tell us about, you know, Poisson regression, because, you know, there's a limit to what your presenters are going to do. I've been quite impressed, actually, that since I stopped giving people papers, some of our presenters have been quite good at actually doing a stats learning point by themselves, which I think is useful. And then just going over my believability and generalizability. And in this case, I just highlighted the fact that actually there are tests criteria for a screening test, and this doesn't meet it. Oh, and then the sort of nobody's perfect slide. So that's my sort of example presentation that I no longer give, but have just given just now because my rota ran out, because I'd failed to find a new rota coordinator. So I'd failed, you know, the basic tenet of organising a journal club. So any more thoughts, questions? Was that helpful? Was that useful? Was that what you expected?
Massively helpful, Sean. Could I ask you another one?
Yeah.
Well, we've got you because you're obviously the man to ask. We've got a statistician who's kindly agreed to give us a talk in June, and I did jot down already what you have already mentioned, but have you got any thoughts about what they'd be best spending an hour talking about for paediatric doctors in training?
Is it for this group?
Yes.
So I think probably it's worth your having a little conflab together. And it's also worth, if anybody's had good talks from statisticians in the past, to sort of share that. Because I think, you know, sometimes some people might get useful information just from thinking about what sorts of data might you expect to be parametric and non-parametric. What sorts of, you know, what you can do with those data in terms of transformations, back transformations, etc. Other people might not find that so useful because they know it. Then if people, you know, anyone who's got a good way to explain non-linear regression, so logistic regression. And I think one of the things that was really useful to me is understanding, you know, what the alpha and beta coefficients and the intercept actually mean, because I think that's one of the things. We use logistic regression a lot, don't we? And I don't think many people sort of have a good grasp on the fact that a beta coefficient turns into your odds ratio, etc. And the fact that actually all logistic regression is you've got your outcome, and then you've got a, you know, and your offset plus beta times your first variable plus beta 2 times your second variable plus beta 2 times your third variable. And actually, when you write it down, none of that actually makes sense. But then when you think about, well, actually how I've put this model together and then what those individual things are. So maybe a little bit of basics about logistic regression models, what the equation means. Are there good or bad ways of going about generating models? You know, do you do forwards, backwards elimination, etc.? Do you worry about collinearity? You know, where two variables are really closely associated with one another, and you end up eliminating the wrong value. You know, you end up eliminating smoking instead of social class, or vice versa. You know, because they're so closely associated. The other things are, you know, that are interesting questions, particularly if people are really going into research, is things like matching. What should you match on in a case control study? Over matching, you know, which is a thing. So I think if it's just one session, it kind of depends. You know, there may even be value in talking about what, you know, different types of data. That may be as obvious as that, you know, thinking about what, you know, there's parametric and non-parametric, but your ordinal data and categorical data and the risks inherent in accidentally, you know, working on the values of randomly assigned, you know, ordinal data. So, you know, it may even be useful thinking about that. So I think it's those sorts of things, and also deciding, do we want this talk to be useful to people going into research themselves, or do we want this talk to be useful for people to do, you know, critical appraisal and do that well? Sorry, there was one other thought that I had in my head. Oh yes, so one of the things that I think would be a good example to fit in there somewhere is maybe some examples of assumptions that go in to certain statistical methods and how you might accidentally break them. And by that, I mean, one of the nice things about chi-squared is that it's a pretty much assumption-free model, you know, whereas, and the more you work, but then if you're actually looking at different ways that you might adjust for variables, you know, there can be assumptions, for example, that the variance within the two populations is similar, and if you haven't checked for that, then that's a bit of a problem. That sounds very esoteric, but for those people who are going into research, it's something that will make sense to the statistician, and they might have good examples for that. On the other hand, if they raise their eyebrows and go, "What are you talking about?" I wouldn't push it.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
Hi, Sean. Sorry, I was having mic issues in the beginning. Thank you so much for coming and having this talk with us. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope people have learned from it as well. But thank you so much. Verena is putting up a feedback code. It should be on our screens in a second. So if everybody can please fill out the feedback form, and that should get you an attendance certificate as well. Thank you, Sean.
All right, thanks very much.
And just to let you know that the next session that we've got coming up is in May, on the 16th of May, where Kath Johnson is talking to us about the COMET study. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you for our next session. But I'll give you back to Sean just to summarise the session, and if he wants to add any more comments. So thank you, and then at the end of that we'll pop up the feedback form again. Back to you. Brilliant. So we'll just pop up that feedback form for you all. Thank you very much for joining. Wait to access the feedback. Are you able to access?
Yeah, we'll be able to fill out the comment.
Sorry, I'm just unable to access the feedback form. I joined in with my phone, so I'm unable to scan the code. Is there any other way I could work around that, please?
Yeah, so there's the code that's on the presentation, and I'm trying to get into the chat, but for some reason I can't find the chat function.
Would you drop any? Do you have the Bridge email address? If you send us an email, we'll reply to that with the feedback code.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi guys, I'm going to head off.
Lovely. So I'll try and put the feedback link in the chat as well, but for you, and is it only one person who can't access the feedback form at the moment?